Welcome back, friends, to a quiet hour spent looking deeply into the long shadows of the past. Tonight, our gentle study continues to focus on a strange, profound, and deeply unsettling historical figure, the knight who was not merely brave, but truly feared. We are moving far beyond the bright, polished tales of chivalry, those shining myths of white armor, noble deeds, and courtly love. Tales often woven centuries after the events they describe to sanitize the bloody realities. Instead, we listen intently for the cold, low hum of dread that inevitably followed the formidable men across the muddy, blood-soaked fields of medieval Europe. And we will finally trace that dread to its ultimate, silent conclusion, the death of the legend. The darkness in this history is not loud. It is creeping, pervasive, and persistent, a silent promise of inevitable ruin that settled into the soul of anyone who heard the rumors of their approach. The very concept of a feared knight, once you strip away the layers of romantic poetry and the stained Geacher glory that often obscures the historical truth, is less about a man's momentary courage in a duel and far more about his uncompromising efficiency. We are not discussing the fictionalized monsters of Hollywood or the exaggerated folk tales designed to frighten children into obedience. We are discussing reputation, a reputation so potent and so pervasive that the mere whisper of the man name traveling ahead of his army by weeks could cause an entire town or even a heavily fortified garrison to surrender immediately, before the first arrow was loosed or the first axe was swung against the gate. That, truly, is the most frightening and devastating kind of knight. They weren't just deadly, they were psychologically devastating instruments of war. Their power resided not merely in their steel, but in the paralyzed minds and broken wills of their enemies. We must first consider the physical reality, the sheer, intimidating presence of the knight on the field. The full harness of plate armor, particularly by the later Middle Ages, was a profound marvel of human engineering, a stunning testament to the available metallurgy and the meticulous craftsmanship of the Ed. This armor made a man seem larger, heavier, slower in the precise movements, yet simultaneously utterly invulnerable. He appeared an animated statue of cold, unforgiving steel, a seemingly tireless engine of destruction. To face such a figure on the field, one covered in a coat of arms that perhaps already held a reputation for ruthless, unwavering effectiveness, the mind naturally begins to retreat from the inevitability of the conflict, calculating the immediate survival cost. The terror they instilled was often not by their own singular strength or the ferocity of their charge alone, but by the sheer, cold final level of their calculated, unwavering actions. There was no recourse, no bargaining, no appeal to mercy, only doom. The story of Richard the Lionheart. The unpredictable fury. We begin our detailed examination with a man whose name became synonymous with uncompromising, total destruction on the battlefield. A man who, to his enemies, seemed to possess no soul beneath his gleaming royal armor. Richard the Lionheart. Richard I of England, king and crusader, is usually portrayed in popular culture as the height of the heroic king, the embodiment of chivalric glory, charging forward with a massive sword drawn in a glorious rush of noble intent. Yet, to those who opposed him, and crucially even to those who served him and observed him closely, he was recognized as a force of overwhelming volatile power and unpredictable fury. His physical ferocity in battle was legendary, often bordering on the reckless, yet always terrifyingly effective and strategically caked. He did not fight for mere sport, he fought to win, completely, irrevocably, and brutally. But the deeper, more unsettling source of his pervasive fear was his ability to commit to acts of calculated, brutal final vow without a perceptible flicker of remorse or even hesitation. The contemporary chronicles, often written by men who revered him, tell us that Richard viewed military actions a matter of cold, pragmatic accounting, prioritizing strategic gain above all notions of morality or traditional chivalric sentiment. Consider the atmosphere following the successful but exhausting Siege of Acre in 1191 during the tumultuous Third Crusade. Richard had finally captured the city. A significant victory, but a negotiation stalemate arose with Saladin over the exchange of prisoners and the custody of the sacred relic of the Holy Cross. Richard, already frustrated by the oppressive delays, the searing heat of the Levantine sun, and seeing his royal authority challenged by the drawn-out negotiations in the hostile environment, made a devastating, unforgettable decision. He ordered the immediate mass execution of between 2,000 and 3,000 Muslim prisoners. This was not a chaotic frenzy born of momentary rage among the rank-and-file soldiers who were often driven by temporary bloodlust. This was a cold, high-stakes political statement, sanctioned and ordered by the highest authority, carried out by his men in clear sight of Saladin's waiting army. By carrying out this unforgivable act, Richard sent a chilling, undeniable message across the entire region. He would not be trifled with. His word was absolute, and his vengeance was swift, decisive, and total, overriding all custom and decency. For the men of Saladin, the fear was that facing Richard meant not just facing a powerful king, but facing an unyielding force that would ignore all conventional codes of mercy when it suited his ultimate strategic goals. His very presence meant that all hope of clemency vanished, and that is a terrifying realization for any soldier, whether friend or foe. The death of Richard the Lionheart. A whisper of fate. How did such a man, an engine of destruction whose name echoed across continents, finally meet his end? It was not in a grand crusade or a heroic pitched battle against a rival king. The irony of Richard's demise is profound, a sudden, quiet anticlimax to a loud, violent life. In Lausanne 99, Richard was besieging the small, poorly defended Châlus-Chabrol castle in central France, a possession of a minor viscount. The conflict was minor, almost petty, revolving around a claim to a small hoard of gold found by a local lord. The siege itself was a tedious, routine affair, far beneath the dignity of the English king, who had just returned from years of crusading and captivity. On the evening of March 26, while inspecting the defenses of his siege works, Richard approached the walls of the castle without his full armor, perhaps out of arrogance, boredom, or simple fatigue after a long day. From the battlements, a lone defender, some accounts name him Pierre Basile, others Bertrand de Gourdon, fired a crossbow bolt. The bolt struck Richard in the shoulder, near the neck, a vulnerable spot not covered by his light protection. It was not immediately fatal, but the wound was deep and festered quickly in the unsanitary conditions of a medieval siege camp. The crude field surgeon's attempts to remove the arrowhead only worsened the infection, causing further damage and contamination. Gangrene rapidly set in, consuming the mighty king flesh. The great warrior, the fearsome Lionheart, died on April 6, 1199, not from the sword of a great rival, but from infection following a minor wound inflicted by a low-ranking defender in a petty siege over a small, forgettable treasure. Manner of his death highlights the ultimate vulnerability beneath the armor, the simple biological failure that even the most feared reputation and the fiercest will did not ward off. His last act of fearsome final he reportedly commanded that the man who shot him be brought before him. Upon seeing the archer, Richard surprisingly forgave him and ordered him set free, admiring his bravery. However, after Richard died, the mercenary captain in charge of the siege, an act that better reflected Richard's own brutal nature, ignored the king's last wish and had the archer flayed alive and then hanged. Thus, the fear Richard embodied lingered and continued its violent work even after his last breath. Story of the Black Douglas. Shadows and scorched earth. Moving from the king knight to a figure of pure regional terror, we look to the wild, wind-swept borderlands of Scotland, and the man who taught the mighty English garrisons to fear the very presence of darkness. The Black Douglas. His given name was James Douglas, Lord of Douglas. James Douglas did not favor the grand, shining, chivalric battles that fill the pages of romantic texts and draw the attention of minstrels and poets. He specialized instead in the small, the sudden, the deeply unsettling, the dark, efficient art of guerrilla warfare. While his compatriot Robert the Bruce sought the shining legitimacy of pitched battles to claim his throne, Douglas waged a relentless war of shadows and whispers, a campaign of terror that broke the English will. His tactics were those of a ghost, swift raids, calculated ambushes in the dead of night. and a policy of scorched earth destruction so thorough and unrelenting it would systematically break the morale and the will of any force sent against him. He was famously tireless, a man who never seemed to sleep, earning him the enduring nickname that cemented his place in the anxious corners of the English soldier's folklore, the Black Douglas. His campaign was a campaign of attrition, of psychological wearing down, carried out with silent precision and haunting regular rare. His most chilling action, the one that cemented his fearsome legend and spoke volumes about his ruthless strategic character, was the event known simply as the Douglas Larder. After retaking his ancestral home, Douglas Castle, from the English, he did not simply take possession and re-garrison it. Instead, he executed the entire English garrison, systematically piled the bodies, all available food, and all valuable supplies into the cellar, and then burned the structure completely to the ground, deliberately poisoning the well. The message, delivered with this grotesque, unforgettable flourish, was clear and absolute. This land belongs to Douglas, and those who oppose him will find a fiery resting place where not even the memory of their stay is preserved. English soldiers, knowing the Black Douglas was operating in the area, quickly learned that discretion was the only valor, and chose to abandon fortifications rather than risk facing his haunting, relentless attacks. They feared his very name and the sight of his banner, knowing that resistance meant slow, protracted terror, and that his efficiency demanded a ruthlessness that surpassed mere brutality, achieving a true form of psychological control over the borderlands. The death of a Black Douglas. A king last wish. James Douglas' fearsome life, so steep-pep in the brutal defense of his homeland, had a surprisingly faithful but fittingly violent conclusion. When Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, died in 329, he entrusted his embalmed heart to Douglas, asking him to carry it on a crusade against the enemies of Christ in the Holy Land, fulfilling a vow the king himself could not keep in his lifetime. This final journey was not a personal quest for glory, but a pilgrimage of honor and vengeance, a fitting ultimate task for the fiercest knight in Scotland. Douglas set out with a company of knights, carrying the silver casket containing the king's embalmed heart. He traveled to Spain, where he joined the forces of King Alfonso X of Castile in a campaign against the Moorish kingdom of Granada. In 1330, at the Battle of Teba, during a ferocious engagement, Douglas, the fearless warrior, led a cavalry charge into the thick of the enemy lines, displaying a moment of reckless, fearsome pride and profound loyalty. He reportedly threw the silver casket containing Brucey's heart ahead of him into the thick of the Moorish ranks, shouting, "Lead on as thou wast wont to do, and Douglas will follow thee, or die." He plunged into the fray, but was quickly surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. James Douglas, the knight whom the English feared more than any other, was cut down in the heat of battle, dying a hero-woe death far from his homeland, honoring his king's final wish. His end was not anticlimax, but a bloody final act of defiant loyalty and unshakable courage. His body, along with the recovered heart of Robert the Bruce, was returned to Scotland for burial. The fearsome spirit of the Black Douglas, the one that haunted the English for decades, had finally found its rest in the ultimate service to his lord, ending his legend in a blaze of glory. We resume our quiet journey, moving away from the dynastic warfare of kings and the shadow campaigns of Scottish rebels, and turn our attention across the continent to a figure whose terrifying reputation was not built upon royal glory or ancestral lands, but on sheer, inhuman persistence, earning him a nickname that speaks of fought engineering and unyielding dread. Guts von Berlichingen, the knight with the iron hand. The story of Guts von Berlichingen, the Iron Hand. Guts, born in 1480 in the chaotic and decentralized Holy Roman Empire, operated during a pivotal, chaotic, and profoundly transitional period of social and military upheaval. He served as one of the last true robber knights and independent mercenaries. He was a professional fighter in a time when the centralized feudal world was collapsing and giving way to established, bureaucratic princely states and the rise of the terrifying new weapon of the age, gunpowder. His decades-long career of decentralized private warfare, a career marked by constant raids, localized sieges, and lucrative ransoming, was relentless, disruptive, and immensely profitable, making him a symbol of the old violent order that the new princes desperately tried to suppress. But the true source of his most profound and enduring terrifying mystique was the grievous wound he suffered early in his career, an injury that should have ended his life of conflict instantly and honorably. This defining moment occurred in 154 at the Siege of Landshut, where a devastating cannonball struck him, costing him his entire right hand. This wound would have forced most other knights to immediate, permanent retirement to a monastery or a quiet estate. He didn't retire, as was expected by his enemies, and this defiance is what transformed him from a minor noble into a genuine figure of historical dread. Instead, he commissioned a series of increasingly sophisticated iron prosthetic hands. The most famous of these was an articulated, functional claw, a marvel of early engineering that could grip a sword hilt or a horse's rein, operated by intricate internal springs, levers, and mechanisms controlled by his remaining forearm muscles. This remarkable, menacing iron hand made him an immediate, powerful figure of folklore and dread throughout Germany. Imagine facing a man in battle who has already survived such a crippling wound, only to return with a gleaming metallic limb that announced his presence with the unmistakable, sharp clank of iron against steel at every movement, even when drawing his breath or adjusting his helm. This unique feature made him seem inhuman. He was perceived the tireless metallic engine of war that never knew fatigue or pain in that limb, only cold mechanical purpose. He became the embodiment of the early modern age ruthless embrace of technology to overcome biological limitation. The fear of guts was a local, pervasive terror, particularly for the powerful merchants who traversed the trade routes and the rival minor nobles who tried to exert legal control over their regions. He operated entirely outside the emerging formal legal structures, relying solely on the brute strength of his arms, the loyalty of his mercenary bands, and the silent, terrifying spectacle of that iron appendage. He was, to the peasant and the merchant, the embodiment of disruptive, absolute chaos, the seemingly unstoppable warrior whose only code was to survive, to fight, and to profit, regardless of the consequences to regional stability or the will of any prince, bishop, or emperor. His defiant, legendary response to the opposing Bishop of Bamberg, captured in historical accounts and later enshrined in German drama by Goethe, only solidified his image of the absolute, unforgiving rogue, a creature of iron will and iron fist, unstoppable and immune to the normal vulnerabilities of the flesh. His legacy is one of pure, unyielding survival against the changing tide of history. The death of Götz von Berlichingen. Long, quiet rest. Given the extraordinary violence of his life, his decades spent in constant feuding, banditry, and defying imperial law, one might expect Götz von Berlichingen to meet a swift and brutal end on the battlefield, perhaps finally overwhelmed by the forces of the Holy Roman Empire he so fain defied. Yet the final chapter of his life is perhaps the most improbable and anticlimactic, a testament to his sheer, stubborn, iron-willed survival instincts. Despite spending time in prison for his transgressions, participating in countless battles, and engaging in personal feuds that lasted decades, Götz managed to live an extraordinarily long life, far outstripping his contemporaries. He was active militarily well into his 70s, participating in major conflicts such as the disastrous Peasants' War in the 1520s, where he commanded forces, albeit briefly and controversially, and even campaigning against the formidable Ottoman Turks for Emperor Charles V in the 1540s. He simply refused to yield to the fate that claimed every other violent man of his generation. Götz of the Iron Hand did not die by the sword, the lance, or the cannonball. After decades of defying death and imperial authority, Götz simply and quietly retired to his ancestral castle Hornburg. Surrounded by his family, he dedicated his final years to managing his estates and compiling his lengthy and vivid memoirs, which became a celebrated, unvarnished look at the tumultuous and violent era he had so perfectly embodied. The man whose life was defined by the clank of iron and the roar of battle died peacefully in his bed at Hornburg Castle in 5062, at the remarkable age of 82. The fearsome efficiency of the Iron Hand ultimately granted him not a swift warrior's death, but a long, quiet rest, a profound contrast to the chaos and violence he propagated for 6 decades. The knight who seemed more machine than man found the most human end imaginable. The story of Bertrand du Guesclin. Calculated cunning moving back to the grand strategic stage of France during the destructive Hundred Years' War, we encounter a man whose terror was of a far more cerebral, strategic nature, a man who methodically turned the entire landscape into a hostile, suffocating weapon. Bertrand du Guesclin. Born into minor nobility in Brittany around 1320, du Guesclin was an utterly unlikely figure to become a symbol of French resistance and the supreme commander of its armies. He was famously short, stocky, and by all accounts quite plain in appearance, far removed from the tall, handsome ideal of a courtly knight. Yet he became the Consul of France, of the highest military office, because his power stemmed not from charisma or ancestry, but from his sheer, undeniable military brilliance and his absolute rejection of the romantic, often disastrous notion of the chivalric open battle favored by his English opponents. He was a ruthless, patient realist in a world of romanticized violence and suicidal field engagements. The fear du Guesclin inspired was a slow, creeping dread, the terror of being outmaneuvered and systematically dismantled by a mind always 3 steps ahead of the enemy. Where the English favored the grand, destructive frontal assault, the shock charge that brought quick resolution, du Guesclin employed the strategy that came to be known as the Fabian or scorched earth strategy. He absolutely refused to meet the English when they were strongest, particularly not on open ground where their famous longbows were overwhelmingly effective. Instead, he chose a relentless, grinding campaign of raids, calculated ambushes, and quick, devastating sieges against isolated, vulnerable garrisons. His patience was legendary, and his victories were often bloodless affairs sealed by starvation and isolation rather than costly frontal assaults. He famously advised the French King Charles V to wear out the English by frequent skirmishes and suffer no great general battle to be lost. The core of the fear was in his unseen presence. English garrisons would hold a castle convinced of their safety, only to find themselves slowly, meticulously cut off from supplies. Their food lines would be severed, their communications broken, and their lines of retreat vanish into a hostile, controlled countryside managed by du Guesclin's invisible, highly disciplined forces. To fight du Guesclin was to fight an enemy who used the landscape, the local populace, the weather, and the sheer demoralizing weight of time itself as a weapon. This strategy was profoundly demoralizing, breaking the spirit of the English occupation force. He was the master of the long game, a quiet, systematic breakdown of the enemy and will and resources. His reputation earned not through shining, flashy glory, but through quiet, methodical, inevitable victory, was a source of persistent, deep dread. The English learned to fear not his arrival in force, but his calculated, deliberate absence from the main roads, knowing he was closing the trap elsewhere, slowly suffocating their power. The death of Bertrand du Guesclin. The dying oath, the demise of Bertrand du Guesclin, was entirely fitting for a knight whose reputation was built on tireless, ceaseless campaigning and the absolute necessity of victory. The man who refused to allow the English any rest finally found his own end while engaged in a routine, necessary duty of war. In July 380, du Guesclin was leading a French force besieging Château de Randon, a heavily fortified fortress in the south-central French region of Languedoc. The siege was another of his methodic affairs. The garrison, facing certain starvation and exhaustion of their supplies, had promised du Guesclin that they would surrender if they were not relieved by an unappointed date, July 14th. Before that deadline arrived, however, du Guesclin fell suddenly and violently ill. Bertrand du Guesclin, the brilliant strategist who had driven the English out of most of France, died of illness, likely a severe infection or high fever, during the siege on July 380. One day bore the Ottoite surrender. He did not live to see the promised victory. However, the fear and respect he commanded were so absolute that the English garrison, led by the captain who had sworn the oath, still adhered to their promise. On the Ottoite day, the captain marched out of the fortress and laid the key to the castle upon the constable's coffin. This incredible, symbolic act demonstrated that the fear du Guesclin commanded was so powerful that it extended beyond his very life, ensuring his final, victorious command was executed perfectly. Constable who conquered France through his mind was ultimately defeated only by the sudden failure of his body, but his will was honored even by his enemies in their surrender. Understood. Segment 2 is saved. Here is segment 3, covering Hugues de Pay, the Templar founder, and Gilles de Rais, the unchecked evil, with clear headings for their story and death sections, completing the full 4,800-word script in the atmospheric TTS style. Segment 3, Institutional Dread and the Ultimate Reckoning. A plot 600 words. TTS wits now turn our attention to the final figures in our historical study, beginning with a man whose terror was utterly institutional, based on an unyielding religious and military commitment that redefined warfare, the founder of the Knights Templar, Hugues de Pay. The story of Hugues de Pay. The architect of institutional fear, Hugues de Pay, a minor French nobleman from Champagne, did not himself achieve the battlefield renown of a Lionheart or a Douglas. His true terror lay in his profound organizational genius and his spiritual audacity. He was the master architect who forged the first monastic military order, the Knights Templar, fighting monks who were sanctioned and blessed by the highest spiritual authority of the era, the Pope himself. This fusion of fierce piety and unrestrained military violence was unprecedented and deeply terrifying to Christian and Muslim foes. To face a Templar in battle was to face a man who believed his violence was not just justified, but sanctified by God himself, a terrifying certainty of purpose that allowed no human hesitation, no moral second-guessing, and absolutely no fear of death. Their famous rule, established in his time, stated they must never retreat unless vastly outnumbered a ratio of 3 to 1 or greater, meaning that to engage a Templar unit was to commit to a battle to the death. They were an immovable object of profound sacred conviction, a unit that knew only forward motion, victory, or a martyr death. Hugues de Pay turned spiritual fervor into military doctrine. The discipline he imposed was legendary, rivaled only by the most ancient Roman legions. These were not merely highly trained soldiers, they were disciplined religious zealots, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, channeling all the energy typically spent on worldly pursuits into a vain, terrifyingly effective purpose: war for the cross. Sight of their banner, the boson half black, half white, and their stark white mantles bearing the red cross, was enough to cause tremor through enemy formations. To chilling conviction beneath the stark white mantle, the quiet resolve to die for their sacred cause, this was the core of the terror Hugues de Pay helped to create and enforce with ironclad severity and bureaucratic structure. Their reputation became the gold standard of battlefield dread throughout the Crusader states, that ate of pure, unyielding military zeal and spiritual fanaticism that promised no quarter and accepted none in return. The Templars, born from Hugues' vision, became the cutting edge of Western power, simultaneously feared and indispensable. The fear they instilled was the fear of the unstoppable righteous machine, a fear rooted in the knowledge that these men literally had nothing left to lose. The death of Hugues de Pay, the quiet founder, in stark contrast to the dramatic, violent ends of Richard the Lionheart and the Black Douglas, and even the strategic demise of Du Guesclin, the founder of this fearsome eternal order found his end in a moment of quiet serenity. Hugues de Pay achieved the highest pinnacle of spiritual and military power. He established the headquarters of his new order on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, gained crucial Pap recognition through the Council of Troyes, and toured Europe, where he recruited men and amassed immense wealth and land for the burgeoning organization. His life was defined by ceaseless travel, relentless bureaucratic effort, and the constant threat of war. He was the ultimate administrator of terror, not its frontline executioner. Yet Hugues de Pay did not die in a glorious charge against Saladin's forces. He did not perish in a dungeon or by a rival treachery. The founder of the legendary fearsome Knights Templar died peacefully of natural causes in the Holy Land, likely in Palestine, around the year 1136. His death was the quiet cessation of a life dedicated to explosive, singular purpose. The Templar order he built continued to inspire profound, chilling terror for another 2 centuries, eventually amassing a shadow empire of wealth and influence. But its architect simply retired from the world stage, leaving behind a legacy of absolute, chilling discipline. The quiet manner of his passing only emphasizes the sheer institutional force he created, a force that did not depend on his own physical presence, but on the enduring, terrifying power of the idea he established, the eternal, unyielding soldier of God. The story of Gilles de Rais, the unchecked evil. We now turn to the ultimate figure of horror, one whose fear transcends military history and burrows into the darkest recesses of human morality. we revisit the figure who personifies the complete and total perversion of knighthood and chivalry, Gilles de Rais. His story is essential to understanding the history of fear because it shows us that the most visceral, profound, and corrosive terror often stems not from an enemy charge on a distant battlefield, but from a betrayal of trust within the social contract itself, a catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect the innocent. Gilles de Rais, the once shining, heroic Marshal of France who famously fought alongside Joan of Arc, was for a time utterly untouchable in 1/5th century society. His immense pedigree, his unimaginable inherited wealth, and his high aristocratic status shielded him from any meaningful scrutiny, allowing his horrifying depravity to flourish unimpeded for years behind thick stone walls. A fear of Gilles de Rais was unique in its intimacy, its secrecy, and its scale. It was the fear of the predator protected by power. His terror was local, intimate, and horrifyingly systematic. While other knights instilled fear in opposing armies or rival nobles, de Rais preyed on the most vulnerable, the local peasantry whose children began disappearing silently into the deep dungeons of his massive, private castles, such as the infamous Château de Tiffauges. He squandered his inherited fortune, one of the largest in Europe, on lavish spectacles, experimental alchemy, and elaborate dark rituals in an effort to regain his wealth and power. However, his ultimate source of dread was his systematic luring, kidnapping, torture, and murder of possibly hundreds of children, mostly peasant boys, across his sprawling estates in Brittany. The vast sums of money he poured into his dark pursuits, and the political connections he maintained initially, ensured a wall of silence and impunity. The sheer, unchecked nature of his evil, operating openly under the cloak of nobility and privilege, is what cemented his place in history as a figure of absolute existential dread, the chilling, paralyzing knowledge that the very institution meant to defend the weak was instead consuming them from within, hidden behind fortress walls and titles that guaranteed impunity. The crimes committed within the high, inaccessible walls of his fortresses were whispered across the countryside, creating a cloud of local terror that made mothers fear for their own homes. The silence surrounding his castles was not the silence of peace, but the terrifying silence of absolute, aristocratic control and corruption. The death of Gilles de Rais, judgment and the fire. Unlike his fearsome contemporaries, Gilles de Rais did not die in battle or in bed. His end was a profound public spectacle designed to cleanse society of his unspeakable evil and to restore moral order after such a monstrous violation of trust. His wealth was so vast and his power so entrenched that it was not initially the civil authorities who finally broke him, but the ecclesiastic court, driven by the Bishop of Nantes, who investigated his crimes after de Rais made the fatal mistake of attacking and occupying land belonging to a church official. Once the inquiry began, driven by the church's power and the raw, undeniable evidence of missing children, the scope of his crimes, including torture, murder, and dark magical practices, was revealed in horrifying detail. De Rais initially denied the charges, relying on his noble status, but under the psychological weight of the evidence and the threat of excommunication pronounced by the bishop, he finally broke down and delivered a full, horrific confession to the charges. Gilles de Rais was subsequently convicted by the secular and ecclesiastic authorities. On October 26, 1440, the man who was once a hero of France, a companion of a saint, was hanged and then his body was burned at the stake in the city of Nantes. The manner of his death was a complete and utter repudiation of his entire life and title. His final end was not an accident, a fever, or a soldier duty, but a judgment. The burning of his body symbolized the community's desperate need to purge the stain of his corruption. While gruesome, the public nature of the execution ensured that the ultimate end of the knight who embodied unchecked evil was a final, public, and definitive destruction. The fear he created was not only validated, but spectacularly avenged by the very society he thought he ruled. We have explored the various engines of dread in profound detail, the unpredictable fury of Richard the Lionheart, ended by a petty wound, the inhuman persistence of guts with the iron hand, ended by old age, the institutional fanaticism of Hugues de Pray, ended by a quiet rest, the method thought, creeping strategic dread of Bertrand du Guesclin, whose will conquered even his death, the desperate, bloody end of the Black Douglas, who died fulfilling a final vow, the monstrous, unchecked betrayal of Gilles de Rais, whose terror ended in public execution. What truly unites these disparate men is their uncompromising resolve and the terrifying clarity of their purpose, which instilled a fear that lasted far beyond the battlefield. But now their wars are long finished, their turmoil is contained, their terror inert, their destructive power dissipated into the air we breathe. We let the heavy silence of their history serenade us now, finding a strange, peaceful calm in the knowledge that their world of conflict is utterly and irrevocably over, and we are safe, separated from their deadly path by the gentle, dark curtain of time.
Rest now, friends. Good night.